March 1943. The North Atlantic moves in slow gray swells beneath a sky the color of slate. A U-boat commander stands in the conning tower of his vessel, scanning the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars. The sea is empty. The air is cold. For 2 years, these waters belonged to Germany, but something has changed. The convoys that once scattered at the first torpedo strike now hold formation. The merchant ships that burned so easily in 1941 now sail in tight columns, protected by corvettes whose propellers churn the water with a new kind of certainty. And the ocean itself, once a refuge for the submerged hunter, has become transparent in ways no submariner was trained to anticipate. The kills are fewer, the losses are mounting, and in the silent hours between dawn and dusk, when the diesel engines idle and the crew listens to the hydrophones, there is a sound that should not be there, a faint, rhythmic ping, growing louder, coming closer, methodical and patient as a clock counting down. The war beneath the Atlantic had begun with confidence. In the autumn of 1939, Karl Donitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, possessed fewer than 60 operational submarines, but he understood their potential with a clarity that few in the Kriegsmarine shared. His doctrine was simple: attack merchant shipping, sever Britain's lifeline to North America, and starve the island nation into submission before the United States could fully mobilize. The Type 7 U-boat, compact and reliable, could dive to 300 feet, cruise submerged for 80 miles, and carry 14 torpedoes. Its greatest advantage, however, was not mechanical, it was operational. Donitz had developed the Wolfpack tactic, Rudel tactic, whereby multiple submarines would coordinate their attacks on a single convoy, overwhelming the escorts and striking from multiple angles in the hours of darkness. The strategy proved devastatingly effective. In the first 4 months of the war, U-boats sank over 200,000 Allied merchant vessels. By the summer of 1940, with France fallen and German submarines operating from bases along the Atlantic coast, the tonnage loss climbed into the hundreds of thousands. British sailors called it the happy time. German submariners called it the same. But by early 1943, the happy time was over. The rhythm of the war had shifted. Convoys that once took days to locate were now being intercepted by Allied aircraft and surface vessels with alarming regularity. U-boats that had once approached undetected were now forced to dive long before reaching firing range. And when they submerged, the pinging followed, a sound transmitted through water, bouncing off the steel hull, returning to its source with geometric precision. It was a sound that stripped away invisibility. The submariners had been trained to rely on darkness, on the vast emptiness of the ocean, on the limitations of human sight. They had not been trained for a technology that could see through water. Sonar had existed in rudimentary form since the First World War. The British called it ASDIC, an acronym derived from the Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. Though the name was misleading, the committee had been dissolved years earlier, but the designation persisted. The principle was straightforward. A transducer mounted beneath a ship's hull would emit a pulse of sound into the water. If the pulse struck an object, submarine, wreck, or seamount, it would return as an echo. By measuring the time between transmission and return, operators could calculate distance. By noting the direction of the strongest echo, they could estimate bearing. Early ASDIC sets were crude. Their range was limited to 1,500 yards under ideal conditions, and performance degraded sharply in rough seas or when the hunting vessel was moving at speed. Detection required patience, skill, and a great deal of luck.
Yet even in its imperfect state, ASDIC represented a fundamental shift. For the first time in naval history, a submerged vessel could be tracked without visual contact. The German submariners knew about ASDIC. Intelligence reports from the early months of the war described the equipment and its approximate capabilities. But knowledge is not the same as experience. In 1940 and 1941, when U-boats were sinking 500,000 tons of shipping per month, ASDIC seemed more theoretical than practical. Convoy escorts were few, and their equipment was often old or poorly maintained. Operators were inexperienced, and doctrine for coordinated anti-submarine warfare was still being written. The U-boats remained ascendant. Then, gradually, the variables changed. The Royal Navy expanded its escort fleet, commissioning corvettes, frigates, and destroyers equipped with improved ASDIC sets. Operators were trained more rigorously, learning to distinguish between a submarine's echo and the clutter of biological noise, temperature layers, and seabed topography. Attack procedures were standardized. When a U-boat was detected, the escort would close at high speed, forcing the submarine deeper, and deploy depth charges set to detonate at varying intervals and depths. The explosions did not need to strike the hull directly. A detonation within 50 feet could buckle plating, shatter gauges, rupture seals, and leave a crew in darkness, bleeding from the ears as seawater flooded the compartments.
But ASDIC alone could not account for the transformation. In the spring of 1943, a second technology entered widespread service, and it operated on principles entirely different. Radar had been developed in Britain during the late 1930s, initially as a means of detecting aircraft at long range. By 1940, ground-based radar stations along the English coast could track incoming Luftwaffe formations at distances exceeding 100 miles, providing fighter command with critical minutes of warning. The application of radar to maritime patrol, however, required miniaturization. An aircraft could not carry the massive transmitters and receiver arrays used in ground installations. British scientists and engineers, working under intense pressure, developed compact radar systems that could be mounted in the nose or belly of a patrol aircraft. These sets operated on wavelengths measured in centimeters, allowing them to detect objects as small as a surfaced submarine's conning tower at ranges of several miles, even in darkness or heavy weather. By 1943, the majority of RAF Coastal Command aircraft were equipped with centimetric radar. The implications were immediate and profound. U-boats, which had previously surfaced at night to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat, could no longer do so with impunity. The darkness that had once provided concealment now offered none. Aircraft equipped with radar could approach undetected, guided by the echo of reflected microwaves, and release depth charges or acoustic homing torpedoes before the submarine's lookouts saw the silhouette against the stars. The German response was improvisation under pressure. U-boat commanders began installing radar warning receivers, devices that could detect the emissions of Allied radar sets and provide a few seconds of warning before an attack. These receivers, known as METOX and later NOXOS, were effective against older radar systems, but struggled to detect the newer centimetric wavelengths. The technology gap widened. Dönitz ordered submarines to remain submerged for longer periods, running on electric motors and conserving battery power. But submerged endurance was limited. A Type 7 could operate underwater for approximately 80 miles at cruising speed before exhausting its batteries. After that, it had no choice but to surface, exposing itself once again to radar-equipped aircraft. The mathematics were unforgiving.
A convoy crossing the Atlantic might be escorted by 6 destroyers, 8 corvettes, and continuous air cover from patrol aircraft operating from bases in Iceland, Newfoundland, and Northern Ireland. A wolf pack of 8 U-boats, coordinating their approach over hundreds of miles, could no longer mass undetected. They were spotted, tracked, and engaged before reaching attack position. Losses mounted. In March 1943, German submarines sank 95 merchant ships. In April, the number dropped to 56. In May, it fell to 34. During the same month, 41 U-boats were lost. The ratio had reversed. In the operations rooms of Western Approaches Command, located beneath the streets of Liverpool, the transformation was visible in maps and charts. Pins marked the locations of convoys, escorts, and known or suspected U-boat positions. Each pin was updated hourly, based on signals intelligence, direction-finding reports, and aircraft sightings. The room was quiet, illuminated by overhead lights that cast no shadows. Women of the Women's Royal Naval Service moved the pins with long wooden poles, adjusting positions as new information arrived. The maps told a story. In early 1942, the concentration of U-boat activity had centered on the Mid-Atlantic Gap, a region beyond the range of land-based aircraft where convoys traveled unprotected except by their surface escorts. By mid-1943, the gap was closing. Long-range Liberator bombers, equipped with additional fuel tanks and centimetric radar, extended air cover deep into what had been an operational sanctuary. The U-boats, forced to submerge repeatedly, could not maintain contact with convoys. They could not coordinate attacks. They could not recharge. They moved through the Atlantic not as hunters, but as prey, listening to the ping of ASDIC, scanning the night sky for the silhouette of a Liberator, counting the hours until the batteries died.
The transformation was not solely technological. Detection methods had improved, but so had coordination, training, and doctrine. The Allies had developed support groups, flotillas of destroyers and escort carriers that were not tied to any single convoy, but could respond rapidly to U-boat concentrations. When intelligence indicated a wolf pack forming in a particular sector, a support group would deploy to that area, reinforcing the convoy escorts and saturating the zone with ASDIC searches and aerial patrols. The U-boats found themselves facing not the thin, overstretched defenses of 1941, but layered, persistent coverage that allowed no rest. Commanders who had once spent days tracking a convoy now spent days evading pursuit, blowing tanks to alter depth, shutting down non-essential systems to reduce noise, rationing food and air as the batteries drained and the oxygen levels dropped. Crew morale, which had been sustained by the camaraderie and adrenaline of successful attacks, began to erode. The sinkings were fewer. The patrols were longer, the odds were worse, and the enemy was everywhere, unseen but always present, manifested as a sound transmitted through water, as a signal reflected from a conning tower, as the distant rumble of propellers closing from astern. The engine noise had become its own form of communication. In the early years of the war, U-boat commanders learned to recognize the acoustic signatures of different Allied vessels. A destroyer's turbines produced a high-pitched whine. A corvette's reciprocating engines generated a slower, rhythmic thump. A merchantman, heavily laden, labored through the swells with a deep, resonant throb. These sounds carried through water for miles, and experienced sonar operators could identify a target by ear alone, estimating its speed, bearing, and approximate tonnage without ever seeing the vessel. But by 1943, the Allies had learned to use sound as a weapon.
Depth charges, when detonated, created pressure waves that propagated through the ocean with crushing force. Even a near miss could incapacitate a submarine. The explosions were not always audible in the conventional sense. Sometimes they arrived as a sudden, overwhelming compression that collapsed eardrums, shattered light bulbs, and drove the boat downward as if struck by a hammer. Other times they were a series of distant thuds, each one closer than the last, counting down a sequence that everyone aboard understood. The escorts would drop a pattern of charges, wait for the result, then adjust and drop again. The process could continue for hours. In the darkness of the submerged hull, with all machinery shut down to avoid detection, the crew would sit in silence, listening as the explosions walked across the seabed, searching. The shift in detection methods forced a corresponding shift in psychology. German submariners had entered the war with a self-image rooted in skill, daring, and technological advantage. They saw themselves as an elite force, operating the most advanced submarines in the world, trained in tactics that the enemy could not counter. This confidence was reinforced by early success, but confidence once shaken is difficult to restore. The first time a U-boat crew experienced a sustained depth charge attack, the event might be rationalized as bad luck, poor positioning, or an unusually skilled escort commander. The second time, doubt began to creep in. The third time, the doubt became certainty. The ocean was no longer safe. The enemy could find them, track them, and kill them at will. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Submariners depend on the assumption that their vessel, when submerged, is effectively invisible. That assumption underpins every tactical decision, every approach, every escape. When it proves false, the foundation collapses. Men who had once slept soundly between watches now lay awake, listening to the creak of the hull, the hiss of air through the recycling system, the faint vibration of the electric motors. Every sound became a potential threat. Every silence became a source of anxiety. And the pinging, when it came, was not just a technological phenomenon. It was a message, transmitted through steel and water and bone, that said, "We know where you are." The statistics bear witness to the transformation. In 1942, the U-boat fleet sank approximately 6 million tons of Allied shipping. The number represents the peak of the campaign. It also represents the peak of German confidence. Dönitz believed that if losses could be sustained at that rate, Britain would be forced to negotiate within 12 months. He requested 300 operational U-boats. He received fewer than 200, but even with limited numbers, the results were devastating. Allied merchant fleets were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Shipyards in the United States worked around the clock to produce Liberty ships, standardized cargo vessels that could be assembled in weeks rather than months. But production alone could not address the fundamental problem. Merchant ships were dying faster than they were being built. Then, in early 1943, the curve bent. Sinkings dropped. Losses stabilized. By May, the rate of replacement exceeded the rate of loss for the first time since the war began. The change was not gradual, it was abrupt, driven by the convergence of multiple factors: improved detection, better coordination, increased air cover, and the closing of the mid-Atlantic gap. The U-boats, which had operated with near impunity for 3 years, suddenly faced an environment where survival required constant vigilance, perfect execution, and extraordinary luck. Most crews possessed none of those things in sufficient measure.
Dönitz recognized the crisis. In late May 1943, he issued a directive withdrawing U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The decision was framed as a temporary measure, a pause to allow for the introduction of new technologies and tactics.
Submarines would be equipped with improved radar detectors, heavier anti-aircraft armament, and schnorkel devices that allowed diesel engines to run while submerged, drawing air through a retractable tube that broke the surface. These modifications were intended to restore the operational balance. They did not. The schnorkel reduced the need to surface, but it also reduced speed and made the boat more difficult to control. The heavier anti-aircraft guns allowed U-boats to fight back against attacking aircraft, but engagements were brief and often ended with the submarine damaged or sunk. The technological race had shifted in favor of the Allies, and no single innovation could reverse it. The U-boat war continued, but its character had changed. What had been a campaign of aggressive commerce raiding became a grinding war of attrition, where success was measured not in tonnage sunk, but in survival rates, patrol duration, and the slim hope of returning to port. The transformation was visible in the faces of returning crews. Submariners who had completed patrols in 1941 returned tanned, confident, decorated with medals and stories of successful kills. By 1943, the men who came back looked older. Their eyes were hollow, their movements were slow. They spoke little about what they had experienced, and when they did, the language was spare and factual. They described the sound of depth charges, the hours spent in darkness, the decision to surface at night, knowing that radar-equipped aircraft could arrive within minutes. They described the cold, the hunger, the diesel fumes that permeated clothing and skin, the taste of recycled air thick with carbon dioxide. And they described the knowledge, unspoken but shared among the entire crew, that the odds of survival were diminishing with every patrol. The Kriegsmarine did not publish casualty figures, but the submariners knew. They attended memorial services for lost comrades. They noticed the empty bunks in the barracks. They read between the lines of official communiques that spoke of heroic sacrifice and strategic redeployment. By late 1943, the survival rate for U-boat crews had fallen below 50%. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in German submarines during the war, 30,000 would not return. The engine noise continued, day and night, a mechanical rhythm that marked the passage of time and the expenditure of fuel. In the operations centers of the Allied navies, the sound of engines signified industrial capacity. American shipyards launched an average of 3 merchant vessels per day throughout 1943. British factories produced escort carriers, corvettes, and destroyers in assembly line fashion, applying the principles of mass production to naval construction. The Liberty ships, though slow and utilitarian, were proof of a system that could outproduce its enemies by an order of magnitude. The U-boats sank hundreds of them. The Allies built thousands. The mathematics were simple and immutable. Germany, with access to the industrial resources of occupied Europe, could produce approximately 20 submarines per month. The Allies, drawing on the manufacturing base of Britain, Canada, and the United States, could replace losses of merchant tonnage and escort vessels faster than they occurred. The war beneath the Atlantic, in the end, was a contest of resources as much as tactics. And resources, like detection methods, had shifted decisively. But the transformation was never purely material. Technology provided the means, but the application of that technology required human judgment, discipline, and the willingness to learn from failure. The early ASDIC operators made mistakes. They misidentified contacts, pursued false echoes, and dropped depth charges on schools of fish or underwater obstructions. Training programs were established to address these errors, teaching operators to recognize the characteristic echo of a steel hull, to compensate for water temperature and salinity, to maintain contact even as the target maneuvered. Doctrine evolved. Escort groups developed standardized search patterns, dividing the ocean into sectors and methodically sweeping each one. Aircraft patrols were coordinated with surface vessels, providing continuous coverage and preventing U-boats from surfacing to recharge. Intelligence analysts at Bletchley Park broke German naval codes, allowing Allied commanders to reroute convoys away from known Wolfpack positions or to direct support groups toward areas of U-boat concentration. The advantages compounded, creating a system that was more than the sum of its parts. The Germans, by contrast, struggled to adapt. New technologies were introduced, but training was curtailed as experienced crews were lost and replacements arrived with minimal preparation. Tactical flexibility declined. Boats operated under increasingly rigid orders, constrained by fuel limitations, fear of air attack, and the relentless pressure of Allied detection.
The epilogue of the U-boat war is written in silence. By the spring of 1945, the Atlantic convoys sailed largely unmolested. Merchant vessels crossed in formations that stretched across the horizon, protected by escorts whose radar and sonar swept the surrounding waters with mechanical precision. The wolf packs had dispersed. The bases along the French coast had been overrun. The surviving U-boats, ordered to continue operations until the end, moved through the ocean like ghosts, hunted by forces they could neither see nor escape. On May 4, 1945, Dönitz, now head of state following Hitler's suicide, ordered the U-boat fleet to cease hostilities. Over the following weeks, more than 200 submarines surfaced and surrendered to Allied forces or scuttled themselves in accordance with final orders. The war beneath the Atlantic, which had begun with confidence and early triumph, ended in exhaustion and defeat. The ocean returned to silence, marked only by the slow passage of merchant ships and the wrecks of submarines that would remain on the seabed for decades, monuments to a technology overtaken and a strategy undone. The transformation was neither inevitable nor swift, but it was complete. Detection methods, ASDIC, radar, signals intelligence, and coordinated air patrol had changed the fundamental terms of submarine warfare. A vessel that could once vanish beneath the waves now carried its location as an invisible signature, transmitted and tracked by systems that operated beyond human perception. The German submariners, trained in the doctrines of an earlier era, found themselves fighting a war for which they were unprepared, against an enemy that could see through darkness and water, that could replace losses faster than they occurred, and that possessed the industrial capacity to sustain operations until victory was achieved. The U-boat war did not end because one side lost courage or skill. It ended because the balance of technology and resources had shifted, and once shifted, could not be reversed. The lesson is a quiet one, inscribed not in monuments or ceremonies, but in the slow accumulation of data, the refinement of systems, and the persistent application of human ingenuity to the problem of survival. The ocean, which had seemed so vast and concealing, became transparent, and the war that had been waged in its depths became finally a war that could be won.